Liverpool, England, November 13, 1965, 7:47 p.m. Chuck Berry stood at the side of the Liverpool Empire Theatre stage, his red Gibson ES 355 in hand, listening to 20,000 voices chanting his name. The sound rolled through the building like thunder, shaking the Victorian walls, rattling the windows, making the floor vibrate under his feet. In 3 minutes he would walk onto that stage and say 4 words that would make every person in that crowd question what they thought they knew about rock and roll. But Chuck wasn't thinking about the crowd. He was staring at the 5 white musicians on stage, running through a sound check of Roll Over Beethoven, and feeling that familiar tightness in his chest. The same feeling he'd carried since walking out of Lompoc Federal Prison 2 years ago. The feeling that everyone was trying to take something from him. The promoter Brian Morrison appeared at Chuck's elbow. Sweat beaded on Morrison's forehead despite the November cold. This was the biggest concert he'd ever promoted. £15,000 invested. Every venue in England wanted to book Chuck Berry fresh off his comeback tour. The man who'd taught the Beatles everything they knew about rock and roll, finally back on stage after his prison sentence.
"Chuck, they're ready for you," Morrison said, his Scouse accent thick with nerves.
"The boys have been rehearsing your arrangements all week. They're good lads, real professionals." Chuck turned to look at Morrison. At 39, Chuck Berry had learned to read men's faces the way other people read books. Morrison's eyes darted between Chuck and the stage, his hands fidgeted with his clipboard. Chuck had seen that look before, in prison wardens, in record executives, in everyone who thought they could manage Chuck Berry. "Professionals," Chuck repeated, his voice flat. The words sat heavy between them. On stage, the lead guitarist was attempting Chuck's signature intro to Maybelline. The notes came out clean, technically correct but empty, like reading Shakespeare without understanding the poetry. Chuck watched the guitarist's fingers, saw the precision, saw the practice, but he didn't see the music. He didn't see the 3 years of armed robbery charges that birthed that song. He didn't see the nights in St. Louis clubs where black musicians weren't allowed to use the front door. He didn't see the pain. The crowd's chanting grew louder. "Chuck, Chuck, Chuck!" Morrison checked his watch. 7:49 p.m. They were already 2 minutes behind schedule. Though they didn't know it yet, they were about to be very, very late.
"Chuck, please. They've paid good money. These kids, they worship you. You're their hero."
Chuck hefted his guitar, felt its familiar weight. This guitar had been with him through everything. Through the chess record sessions that made him famous. Through the Mann Act trial that destroyed his reputation. Through 20 months in federal prison where he'd written some of his best songs on pieces of toilet paper. Now it would be with him through whatever was about to happen on that Liverpool stage. But first, Chuck wanted to understand something. He walked onto the stage. The roar that greeted him was unlike anything he'd experienced. Louder than the crowds at the Apollo, louder than his shows before the trial. These weren't just fans. These were believers. Young faces, mostly white, all turned toward him like flowers following the sun. Girls in the front row were crying. Boys were standing on their chairs, screaming lyrics to songs they'd learned phonetically from imported chess records. The sound was pure adoration mixed with something else, something that made Chuck's stomach tighten. They were worshiping the idea of him, not the man who'd spent his 35th, 36th, and 37th birthdays behind bars. Not the man who'd been strip-searched by guards who called him boy. They were cheering for a mythology, and Chuck Berry was tired of being a myth. The backing band looked at him expectantly. 5 musicians, all in their early 20s. The drummer was setting up behind a Ludwig kit that probably cost more than Chuck's first car. The bass player had a Hofner violin bass just like Paul McCartney's. These weren't bar musicians. These were professionals. The kind who rehearsed every note, planned every movement, treated music like a business. Chuck walked to the microphone. The crowd screaming reached a crescendo, then slowly faded to expectant silence. 20,000 people holding their breath. The stage lights were hot on his face, reminding him of the interrogation rooms where federal prosecutors had grilled him about a 14-year-old girl who'd lied about her age. The memory made his jaw clench. He looked at the backing band, looked at their eager faces, their expensive instruments, their prepared set lists. Then Chuck Berry said 4 words that made the entire crowd gasp. "I don't do rehearsals." The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the building's heating system. You could hear car horns from the street outside. You could hear 20,000 hearts skipping a beat. The lead guitarist, a kid named Jimmy Page who'd been hired specifically for this show, stepped forward. "Mr. Berry, we've prepared all your hits. We know the arrangements. We've been rehearsing for weeks." Chuck smiled. That smile he'd perfected in prison, the one that said nothing and everything at the same time. "Son, if you need to rehearse my music, you don't understand it." Page's face flushed red. He'd been bragging to his friends for weeks about this gig, about how he was going to play guitar with Chuck Berry. Now Chuck was telling him he'd wasted his time. What happened next would become legendary in Liverpool music circles, though most people would get the details wrong. Chuck Berry, without another word to the backing band, launched into Johnny B. Good, but he didn't play it the way they'd rehearsed. He played it faster, in a different key, with blues runs that existed nowhere in the recorded version. The backing band scrambled to keep up. Jimmy Page, who would one day form Led Zeppelin, looked like a music student trying to sight-read a foreign language. The bassist missed his entrance. The drummer couldn't find the pocket. The keyboard player stopped playing altogether, overwhelmed by the sudden chaos. Within 30 seconds, what was supposed to be Chuck Berry's triumphant return to England had become a musical disaster. But Chuck didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Because stopping would mean admitting that the last 2 years had broken something inside him that couldn't be fixed. Instead, he leaned into the chaos, his guitar screaming through the confusion like a man drowning and refusing rescue. The crowd was confused. This wasn't the Chuck Berry they'd heard on records. This was rawer, angrier, more dangerous. Some people started sitting down. Others moved toward the exits. Morrison was frantically gesturing from the wings, trying to get Chuck's attention. To understand why Chuck Berry chose that moment to destroy his own comeback, you had to understand what had happened to him between 1962 and 1965. Prison had changed him, not just emotionally, but philosophically. He'd gone in believing that music could bridge any gap, that talent was enough, that if you were good enough, the world would accept you. He'd come out knowing better. In Lompoc Federal Prison, Chuck had shared a cell with a jazz pianist named Marcus Williams. Marcus had been inside for tax evasion, same as many black entertainers who'd trusted the wrong accountants. But Marcus had taught Chuck something more valuable than money management. He'd taught him about control. "Charlie," Marcus had said one night, using Chuck's real name, "they can take your freedom, they can take your money, they can take your reputation, but they can't take your music unless you give it to them. And once you start giving it away, once you start playing by their rules, you stop being an artist and become a product." Now, on that Liverpool stage, Chuck was remembering Marcus's words. The backing band had rehearsed his music, learned his arrangements, prepared to deliver Chuck Berry to the crowd in a neat, predictable package. But Chuck Berry was not a package. He was a force of nature that had been caged for 20 months and was done pretending to be tame. The second song was worse. Roll Over Beethoven became a train wreck of missed cues and clashing rhythms. Jimmy Page was sweating, his confidence evaporating with each wrong note. The crowd was getting restless. Morrison looked like he was about to have a heart attack. But then something happened that no one expected. A voice from the crowd shouted, "We don't care. We love you, Chuck." Then another voice, "Play anything you want." Soon the entire front section was chanting, not for specific songs, but just for Chuck to keep playing. And in that moment, Chuck Berry remembered why he'd fallen in love with music in the first place. 3 songs in, something shifted. The backing musicians stopped trying to follow their rehearsed parts and started listening to what Chuck was actually playing. Jimmy Page found Chuck's rhythm and locked into it. The bass player threw away his prepared charts and felt his way through the changes. The drummer closed his eyes and played what the music demanded, not what he'd practiced. And suddenly, magic happened. Memphis, Tennessee became a conversation between 5 musicians instead of 4 accompanists following a leader. Chuck's guitar sang in ways it hadn't since before his trial. The crowd, who had been confused by the opening chaos, began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Not a rehearsed concert, but music being born in real time. The energy in the room transformed. The same kids who'd been sitting down were back on their feet. The ones who'd headed for the exits turned around and pushed back toward the stage. Word was spreading through Liverpool that something extraordinary was happening at the Empire. But the real transformation was happening inside Chuck Berry himself. For the first time in 3 years, he felt free. Not the conditional freedom of parole, but the absolute freedom that came from refusing to compromise. Each note he played was a declaration of independence from everyone who'd tried to control him. The show that was supposed to be a disaster became legendary. By the 6th song, Sweet Little 16, the entire Liverpool Empire was shaking. People were dancing in the aisles. The backing band was grinning like they'd discovered electricity, and Chuck Berry was remembering that music wasn't about perfection, it was about truth. During Reelin' and Rockin', Chuck did something he hadn't done since before prison. He smiled. Not the bitter smile he'd perfected inside, but the pure joy smile of a man playing music because he loved it. The crowd saw it and went absolutely wild. When the concert ended after 14 songs, the standing ovation lasted 9 minutes. 9 minutes of pure appreciation from 20,000 people who had just experienced something they couldn't quite name but would never forget. Backstage, Brian Morrison was ecstatic despite the rocky start. "Chuck, that was incredible. The newspapers are going to rave. We could book you in every major venue in England. The BBC wants to interview you." Chuck was packing up his guitar, his movements careful and deliberate. "No," he said quietly. Morrison's face fell. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean no more tours, no more backing bands, no more rehearsals." Chuck closed his guitar case with a decisive snap. "I'm done playing other people's game." Jimmy Page approached, still riding the high of the performance. "Mr. Berry, that was the most amazing musical experience of my life. The way you played tonight, the way you led us without leading us, that's what music should be." Chuck looked at the young guitarist, saw the enthusiasm in his eyes, saw his own younger self before the trials, before the prison, before the bitterness. "Son, you played well tonight, but remember something, the moment you start rehearsing the magic, you kill it." But Page wasn't finished. "Mr. Berry, I have to ask, why? Why did you do that to us? We'd prepared for weeks." Chuck set down his guitar case and really looked at Page. The kid deserved an honest answer. "Because, son, I spent 20 months in a cage being told when to eat, when to sleep, when to speak. Every day was rehearsed. Every moment was controlled. When I got out, I promised myself I'd never let anyone script my life again. That includes my music." Page nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You were testing us." "No," Chuck said. "I was freeing us." What Chuck Berry did that night in Liverpool became the template for how he would perform for the rest of his career. No rehearsals, no prepared set lists, just Chuck Berry, his guitar, and whatever happened when he plugged in. It also marked the beginning of his reputation as a difficult performer. Venue owners complained. Backing musicians struggled. Critics called him unprofessional. But the audiences always left understanding they'd experienced something real. The 5 musicians who played with Chuck that night all went on to significant careers. Jimmy Page credited that performance with teaching him that the best music comes from controlled chaos. The bassist John Paul Jones would remember Chuck's lesson about listening when he later formed Led Zeppelin with Page. But perhaps the most important consequence was what it did for Chuck Berry's relationship with his own music. By refusing to rehearse, by demanding that every performance be a fresh creation, Chuck had found a way to keep his music alive. He had learned to protect the one thing prison couldn't touch, his artistic soul. Brian Morrison never promoted another Chuck Berry concert. Years later, he would tell reporters, "Chuck Berry taught me that there's a difference between booking a musician and booking an artist. Musicians can be managed. Artists can only be experienced." The Liverpool performance was never officially recorded, but bootleg tapes circulated among musicians for decades. Keith Richards called it the most important Chuck Berry performance that never happened, referring to the fact that while thousands witnessed it, the music industry pretended it didn't exist because it couldn't be replicated or commodified. Today, the Liverpool Empire Theatre has a small plaque near the stage door. On this stage, November 13, 1965, Chuck Berry reminded us that the best music cannot be rehearsed. The plaque was installed by Jimmy Page in 1995, 30 years after the concert that changed his understanding of what rock and roll could be. Chuck Berry continued performing until just weeks before his death in 2017. He never rehearsed. He never used prepared set lists. He never apologized for the chaos that sometimes resulted. Because on that November night in Liverpool, he had learned that chaos was just another word for freedom, and freedom was the only thing worth fighting for. The 4 words that shocked 20,000 fans, "I don't do rehearsals," became Chuck Berry's artistic manifesto. They represented his refusal to be managed, packaged, or controlled by anyone except himself. They were his declaration that music was not a product to be perfected, but a living thing that died the moment you tried to pin it down. And in the end, those 4 words saved Chuck Berry's soul.